The woman's face pressed against the saloon's dusty floorboards, blood trickling from her split lip as her husband's boot withdrew from her ribs. Around her, the room had fallen silent. Even the piano player's fingers had stilled on the keys. She didn't move, didn't cry out, just lay there in the sawdust and tobacco stains while Thomas Brennan straightened his vest and reached for his whiskey glass. "Let that be a lesson to any man here who thinks his woman can run her mouth," Thomas announced to the room, his voice carrying the authority of someone who owned half the businesses in Copper Ridge. A wife speaks when spoken to, nothing more. Sarah Brennan remained motionless, her dark hair spilling across her face like a veil. 3 years of marriage had taught her that fighting back only made it worse, that tears only fed his hunger for dominance. So she lay still and counted her breaths, waiting for the moment to pass. That's when the batwing doors creaked open. The stranger who entered wasn't particularly tall, but something in his presence made the room feel smaller. His boots were worn but well cared for, his hat casting shadows across weathered features that spoke of long days under an unforgiving sun. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man who'd learned early that respect wasn't given, it was earned. His eyes swept the saloon, taking in the frozen tableau, the woman on the floor, the man standing over her with casual indifference, the other patrons pretending to study their drinks. When his gaze settled on Thomas Brennan, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "You dropped something," the stranger said quietly, his voice carrying despite its softness. Thomas laughed, a harsh sound that grated against the silence. "Just teaching my wife some manners, friend. Nothing that concerns you." The stranger's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture, a subtle straightening that made several men near the bar take unconscious steps backward. He walked forward slowly, deliberately, his spurs creating the only sound in the suffocating quiet. When he reached Sarah, he knelt beside her with movements that were surprisingly gentle for hands that bore the calluses of hard labor. "Ma'am," he said softly, extending his hand, "let me help you up." Sarah's eyes met his, clear gray eyes that held no pity, only a steady warmth that made something long frozen in her chest begin to crack. For the first time in 3 years, someone was looking at her like she was worth saving. But as she began to reach for his outstretched hand, Thomas's shadow fell across them both. "I said she's my wife." Thomas's voice carried a dangerous edge as his hand moved toward the gun at his hip. "And I'll thank you to keep your hands off what belongs to me." The stranger rose slowly, positioning himself between Sarah and her husband. "Funny thing about belonging," he said, his voice still quiet but carrying a steel undertone that made the hair on Sarah's neck stand up. "I always figured people belonged to themselves, not wives." Thomas spat. "Not in my house, not in this town." "Sarah, get up and apologize to this man for causing trouble." Sarah pushed herself to her hands and knees, her body protesting every movement. She could feel the weight of every eye in the saloon, could sense the familiar pattern about to unfold. She would apologize, Thomas would forgive her publicly, while promising worse privately, and life would continue its grinding cycle. But the stranger extended his hand again, and this time she took it. He helped her to her feet with careful strength, steadying her when she swayed. Up close, she could see the silver threading through his brown hair, the lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting into too many sunsets. There was something solid about him, something that made her feel like she could breathe fully for the first time in years. "What's your name?" he asked her, ignoring Thomas completely. "Sarah," she whispered, her voice rusty from disuse. "Sarah," he repeated, as if testing the weight of it. "I'm Marcus Webb. I run cattle about 10 miles north of here." He turned to face Thomas, and his voice hardened. "And I'm thinking Sarah might benefit from some fresh air." The saloon erupted in murmurs. Thomas's face flushed deep red, his hand now resting openly on his gun grip. "You're suggesting I can't care for my own wife?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Marcus replied. "I'm stating it plain." The standoff stretched like a taut wire. Sarah found herself caught between terror and hope, between the devil she knew and the salvation she hardly dared believe in. Around them the other patrons began edging toward the doors. Everyone knew Thomas Brennan's reputation, knew he'd killed 2 men in fair, fights that were anything but fair. But Marcus Webb didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't show any sign of backing down. "This is still a free country," he said finally. "And unless I'm mistaken, the lady can choose for herself where she wants to be." He turned to Sarah, his grey eyes holding hers. "What do you say, ma'am? You want to stay here, or would you like to see what fresh air tastes like?" The question hung in the air like smoke, heavy with possibility and danger. Outside, horses snorted and harnesses jingled as riders approached. The sound of Thomas's men, no doubt, drawn by the commotion. The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied by the jingle of spurs and the creak of leather. Through the saloon's grimy windows, Sarah could see the shapes of mounted men, at least 6 of them, all wearing the same grim expressions that marked Thomas's hired hands. "Seems like your boys heard the call," Marcus observed, his hand resting casually near his own weapon. "Funny how quick they come running when there's trouble." Thomas's smile was cold and predatory. "They're just looking out for my interests, making sure no one gets any ideas about taking what's mine." He raised his voice so the entire saloon could hear. "See, folks, this is what happens when strangers don't understand how things work in Copper Ridge. They get confused about property and ownership." The batwing doors burst open as the first of Thomas's men entered, a wiry man with pale eyes and a scar running from his ear to his jaw. Behind him came the others, spreading out to cover the exits with practiced efficiency. Sarah recognized them all: Jake Morrison, who'd once broken a man's arm for looking at him wrong; Pete Carver, who'd burned out 3 homesteaders for refusing to sell their land; Dutch Williams, whose reputation with a knife was whispered about in the darkest corners of town. "Problem here, Mr. Brennan?" Jake asked, his hand already resting on his gun butt. "Just a misunderstanding," Thomas replied, never taking his eyes off Marcus. "This fellow seems to think he can walk into my town and tell me how to handle my wife." Marcus remained perfectly still, but Sarah could sense the change in him, a coiling tension like a spring being compressed. "Your town?" he asked quietly. "That's interesting. Last I heard, Copper Ridge belonged to the people who lived here." "People like me," Thomas said. "People with money, influence, power. People who understand that some things are just the natural order." He gestured dismissively at Sarah. "Women need firm guidance. Children need discipline. The weak need to know their place. And who decides what that place is?" Marcus asked. "The strong do," Thomas replied. "The ones with the will to enforce their decisions." The standoff stretched tighter. Sarah could feel her heart hammering against her ribs, could taste the metallic flavor of fear and desperate hope mixing on her tongue. Around the room, the other patrons had pressed themselves against the walls, desperate to avoid being caught in the crossfire of whatever was coming. Marcus looked around the saloon, taking in the faces of Thomas's men, calculating odds and angles. When his gaze returned to Sarah, she saw something flicker in his expression, not resignation, but a kind of grim determination that made her breath catch. "Well then," he said finally, his voice carrying a finality that made the room feel like a powder keg with a lit fuse, "I guess we'll just have to see who's stronger." He took a half step forward, positioning himself directly in front of Sarah. "Because here's what's going to happen. The lady is going to walk out of here with me. Anyone who has a problem with that can discuss it with me directly." Outside, more horses arrived, the sound of boots on wooden sidewalks, the metallic click of guns being checked and readied. In the breath between heartbeats, as the entire saloon held its collective breath, Marcus did something unexpected. He turned slightly towards Sarah, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for her ears. "My sister had a husband like yours once," he said quietly, his eyes never leaving Thomas's face. "Found her in a cabin up near Silver Creek, beaten so bad I almost didn't recognize her. She was too scared to leave, too broken to fight back." His jaw tightened. "I should have acted sooner, should have done something before it was too late." Sarah felt something crack open inside her chest. "What happened to her?" "She died that winter," Marcus replied, his voice steady, but carrying a weight that spoke of old grief carefully contained. "Pneumonia took her, but it was really shame and fear that killed her. She died believing she deserved what he gave her." Sarah's hand moved instinctively to touch the bruises on her throat, hidden beneath the high collar of her dress. "I'm not your sister." "No," Marcus agreed, finally looking directly at her. "You're not, but you're somebody's daughter, somebody's hope, somebody's dream of what life could be, and no one has the right to grind that into the dirt." From his vest pocket, he withdrew something small and pressed it into her palm. Sarah looked down to see a silver locket, tarnished with age but still beautiful. Inside, when she opened it, was the miniature portrait of a young woman with kind eyes, and Sarah's same stubborn chin. "Her name was Mary," Marcus said. "She gave me that the day before she married him, told me to keep it safe until she could take it back. I've been carrying it for 8 years, waiting for a chance to make things right." Sarah's fingers closed around the locket, feeling its weight, not just the silver, but the promise it represented, the second chance it offered. Around them she could hear Thomas growing impatient, could sense his men shifting restlessly, but for this moment the world had narrowed to just her, and this stranger who was offering her something she'd forgotten existed. "Choice. I can't promise it'll be easy," Marcus continued. "Thomas won't let this go, and his reach is long. But I've got a ranch, good water, decent land. You'd have a place there, a place where no one would lay a hand on you in anger ever again." "Why?" Sarah whispered. "Why would you do this for someone you don't even know?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes holding secrets and sorrows she couldn't fathom. "Because I couldn't save Mary," he said finally. "But maybe I can save you." The locket seemed to pulse with warmth in her palm, and Sarah felt the last of her chains begin to fall away. "She's mine now." The words fell into the saloon's tense silence like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that changed everything. Marcus spoke them quietly, but with such absolute certainty that even Thomas's hired guns exchanged uncertain glances. "You can't just," Thomas began, his face purple with rage. "I can," Marcus interrupted, his hand now resting openly on his gun grip. "And I am." "Sarah, you ready to go?" Sarah looked around the saloon one last time, at the faces she'd known for 3 years, at the man who'd owned her like livestock, at the prison she'd called home. Then she straightened her spine and lifted her chin with a dignity that made several of the watching men look away in shame. "I'm ready," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in years. The walk to the door seemed to take forever, and no time at all. Marcus stayed beside her, his presence solid and reassuring, while Thomas's men parted reluctantly before them. At the threshold, Thomas made one last desperate play. "You'll be back," he shouted after her. "You'll come crawling back when you realize what you've given up. A house, security, respectability." Sarah paused in the doorway, Marcus's hand gentle but firm on her elbow. She turned back to face her husband one final time, and when she spoke, her voice carried clearly through the room. "I gave up nothing," she said. "I took back everything." Outside, Marcus helped her onto his horse, his movements careful and respectful. As they rode away from Copper Ridge, Sarah felt the locket's weight in her pocket, and realized she was crying, not from pain or fear, but from relief so profound it felt like rebirth. They rode in comfortable silence, until the town disappeared behind them, replaced by rolling hills and open sky. Finally Marcus spoke. "I meant what I said back there. You'll have a place at my ranch, for as long as you want it. No strings, no expectations, just a chance to figure out who you are when no one's telling you who you have to be." Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. In the distance she could see the outline of buildings, the promise of a new beginning stretching out before her like the endless horizon. Years later, when she was Sarah Webb in truth as well as name, when the ranch prospered and the children played in the yard she'd planted with her own hands, she would remember this moment. She would remember the weight of the locket, the feeling of choice returning to her life, and the quiet strength of the man who'd whispered those 3 life-changing words. "She's mine now," not as property, but as family, not as possession, but as promise. The difference, she learned, was everything.